welcome to Controlling Contaminated Food. I am pleased to introduce you to our moderator for this panel, Professor Christopher Basso. He's a professor and the Associate Dean at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs here at Christopher Basso is also the Director of the Nanotechnology and Society Research Group. Professor Basso's research focuses on areas such as environmental and food policy and regulatory policy, and he has published extensively on environmental regulation and nanotechnology. Thank you, Professor Basso, for coming today, and the panel's all yours.
Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. This panel will focus some themes that harken back a long time, and I want to sort of spend a couple minutes just sort of setting the tone, if you will. And by the way, and just to establish sort of where I come from, my dissertation many years ago was done on pesticides regulation. Don't ask why I got into pesticides regulation. But when you do work on pesticides regulation, you fall into becoming an expert at agriculture. And you become, because you have to. And then you become an expert in food policy, well, because you have to. So what led from a relatively narrow exploration of changes in federal government regulation of chemical pesticides, which is a long story in its own right, you end up, in fact, focusing on food, which is rightfully where you should be. And so this is about food. And the issues to be discussed in this panel go back to the moment we all stopped growing or producing our own food. Think about it. Until that moment, the issue of food safety was pretty much securely in our own hands. Did a bad job on canning or preserving or whatever, well, we knew who to blame was ourselves. The moment we, in fact, put a gap between us and those who produced our food is the moment when, in fact, we began to think about how do we recruit a third party, usually government, but not always government, to act as our agent, if you will, in ensuring the quality and safety of the food we consume. But if you think about it, I mean, this is not a new question. I mean, after all, this is the first real, we begin this story really in the early 20th century. Obviously they were later. The moment we had refrigeration cars and could ship massive amounts of beef across country, the moment we got into canning of food and worried about botulism, in the late 19th century, the moment that, in fact, these things all come together, of course, we all know that the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 is the beginning of federal government intervention into a more complex marketplace than existed before. So we have federal action through the FDA, Department of Agriculture, and its inspection of meatpacking plants, for example. We have state public health and agricultural laws. We have local city health ordinances. We have a whole array of interventions by government acting on behalf of the consumer in some way, shape, or form in the classic ways that we understand about why governments intervene in marketplaces. Questions of market failure, lack of information, questions about transparency, all those kinds of usual things that any student of regulation understands very well. But if you think about the tensions that have been there traditionally are exacerbated today. I mean, think about the tensions in food policy, some of them which were mentioned by our keynote speakers. Our desire, especially in the American context, although not exclusively, in the American context for abundant and inexpensive and convenient food. Now just think for a moment how that tension resides in all of our food policy questions. We want what we want when we want it, and we want it abundant, and we want it cheap. And we want it to look good, too, if it's from the grocery store. So cheap and abundant. That creates market forces that themselves create pathologies. For example, the meat industry looks to squeeze every cent out of its production processes because the margins are so narrow in the industrial meat industry. They get into what they call enhanced meat recovery systems, trying to extract every bit of protein from the carcass, which indeed can lead to problems such as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, or other kinds of problems in meat packing plants or in just the transmission of meat. in the industrial meat chain. So we have the market forces that to produce cheap and abundant food that sometimes veer into problems of safety. We have the long food chains. I mean, again, it used to be that we worried about the food coming from maybe the periphery of an urban area, 20 miles. Now we worry about food or think about food coming from anywhere in the world. If you want your raspberries in February, guess what? They're not coming from outside of Boston. They're coming from way outside Boston, probably Guatemala. If you want your inexpensive seafood, they're coming from Southeast Asia. They're coming from somewhere else. And so the lengthening of the food chains introduce more players whose hands are literally on the produce or on the food. So there's a global scale and reach of the food chain, which creates even greater dilemmas. Counterbalance that, of course, is the local war movement of more recent years. The ironic part about it, of course, is that we are, as Tony Maws mentioned, and it's quite clear, the more we're trying to also to cultivate local producers means that it creates even greater complexity. Because an entire food system based in some respects on large providers, industrial food, doesn't work very well, as we know, as we'll find out, for small providers. And indeed, the question about how small providers can conform to certain basic cleanliness and safety regulations is a tough question. We have issues of transparency. How do we know, as consumers know? In fact, some cities like Los Angeles, for example, have posted rating systems on restaurant windows, A, B, C, which reflects the latest inspections. So consumers who want to go to a restaurant have a quick glance and say, A, this restaurant passes recent inspection. So that kind of consumer transparency, consumer information metric. And finally, perceptions of risk. And this is perhaps the trickiest part of all. We want our food safe, we want it abundant, we want it inexpensive, but what safe means is a contested area. What kind of risk are we as consumers willing to take to get what we want when we want it? And what kind of risks should we be exposed to? Notice that those are two different metrics. And how does, for example, media coverage of these issues convey perhaps false notions of risk? Again, lots of things going on here. I mean, the latest, of course, example of this is the passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which enhances inspections and creates new kinds of tracking systems. But yet, and anybody who looked at the act knows it's not necessarily going to solve these problems. In fact, it creates perhaps new pathologies. Every new law does. So I think we have an interesting panel today. For the reasons that I expressed, the bios are in the program. And they will go in order of Priscilla Fox, Adam Prizio, and then Balin Linnekin. And I'm looking forward to this panel. Each of them will go about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. So without further ado, Priscilla Fox. Where's the slideshow? There we go.
Right down. There we go.
Okay, and here is.
Let me just turn that on.
Turn it on. Okay. Questions till after, everybody.
Thank you, and good morning. It's great to be here and to see so many people who came through the snow. I want to start out by thanking a person who helped me a lot with this presentation, and that's our Director of the Department of Public Health Food Protection Program, Kim Foley. She's not here today, but she gave me information about the case studies that I'll be talking about. So I'm going to go very briefly through some legal information and then get into the case study so you can actually see visually what our inspectors see in some cases. So in Massachusetts, various sections of the general laws, chapters 94 and 111, various sections of those laws require us to do various things. We license and regulate wholesale food manufacturers. We write regulations for local board of health permitting and licensure of certain specific manufacturers. This is just an artifact of the statutes. It seems strange that why wouldn't bottled water and frozen desserts be food manufacturers just like every other? But the legislature, in its wisdom many years ago, decided to make that a local function to license, but we write the regulations. And by the way, I could talk for hours about this. This is just a very brief overview of what we do. We also write the regulations for restaurants and food stores, which are known in the trade as food establishments, And again, the enforcement is at the local level. So local boards of health, local inspectors will go out twice a year is what's required to inspect each restaurant or grocery store. With respect to adulterated food, sections 186 to 194 of Chapter 94 give us various powers. Adulteration is defined very similarly to the way it's defined in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That our law was obviously modeled on that. But in Section 189A, we have embargo power, and that means that if our inspectors find contaminated or adulterated food in an establishment, they can immediately order it off sale, and usually that is done voluntarily by the business. They recognize it's contaminated, and they agree to dispose of it. But if they don't agree, if there's some kind of dispute, then we have to go to court and file what's called a libel of condemnation. As I say, that rarely happens. And then a third thing we do is that our epidemiology program and Bureau of Lab Sciences investigate cases of possible foodborne illness, working with our food protection program. So I'm going to start out by talking about an inspection of a candy factory. This occurred last summer. Our food inspectors visited for a routine inspection. This is a mid-sized candy manufacturer in Massachusetts. And when they arrived at the factory, the inspectors were detained for a while before being allowed to enter. And this alerts them that there may be possible food safety violations there. The facility may be attempting to clean up quickly and correct violations before the inspectors enter. But when they did enter, as you can see, the facility hadn't done a complete cleanup. This is rodent feces on jelly candies. This is chocolate bars gnawed by rodents. This shows rodent droppings in the candy production room. They also found rub marks from rodent travel on the candy machine. And this is inside the candy tunnel where the candy is produced. So the inspectors also noted in this case that a large percentage of the finished product was affected by rodent contamination. So what did the inspectors do? Well, they arranged for the facility to cease operations immediately and clean and sanitize. And they also required stepped-up pest control. The firm had a contracted pest control company making routine service calls, but obviously not with enough frequency here. So the firm was closed for 10 days while cleaning, and the state inspector did 2 re-inspections before determining that it was adequately cleaned to be reopened. And it's interesting that, keep in mind, why do you see situations like this, and they're not as uncommon as we would like to think, but keep in mind also, we're under some hard economic times, as we all know, and as I think you mentioned, Professor Basso, food is a profit-making business, and they have to focus. Margins are very thin sometimes. Profit has to be maximized, and getting food out the door quickly can be a big priority, is a big priority, has to be. And so safety can slip. It just does. Okay, I'm next going to talk about a trucking accident. I have some more pictures there. Trucking accidents are a big part of DPH's emergency response, and we need to be fast and decisive when something happens to a food truck on the road. So in this case, a call came in to the Food Protection Program Director at 3:30 in the morning one day that a load of sides of beef in a truck had crashed on the Mass Pike toll booth in Boston, and there were sides of beef all over the road, which actually was the case. Here they are. So the director called the field inspector, who rushes to the scene. Police needed to clear the area in time for the morning commute. So again, everything had to happen pretty quickly. The inspector reports back to the director from the scene and described the situation. You can see more of a close-up of the food actually on the road. In this case, as you can see, most of the beef, if not all of it, was contaminated by being on the road, debris from the truck, oil from the road, whatever, insulation from the truck. And so it had to be disposed of in a landfill, and that happened later that day. Now, if this had been packaged food and the packages had not been broken, it might have been able to be salvaged. These are the kinds of decisions that inspectors have to make very quickly on the scene. They have to consider things like time, temperature abuse, the scope of debris from the accident, type of packaging, how well protected the food is, and that kind of thing. And public safety issues take precedence here because the scene of the accident has to be cleared quickly, so you have to, if you're going to consider reconditioning or salvage, you have to know that the food needs to get moved quickly, and that may or may not compromise the integrity of the packaging. Okay, this just shows cleanup, getting ready to clean up at the end, and by now, I guess the commuters are coming through. Do any of you remember this? I don't. You do. Okay. Yeah. I don't know how long ago it was. Do you? Was it? Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, foodborne illness. Next, I'm going to talk about a very interesting foodborne illness investigation. This was about a year ago, December of '09, and it was right before the holidays. So we're into the pre-holiday season. A local hospital, and I don't know where this occurred in Massachusetts, actually. I have the facts, but I don't know where. I wasn't told. So a local hospital notified our state epidemiologist that they were seeing an increase in salmonella cases. And another set of DPH regulations, having nothing to do with food, but we have regs that require disease reporting. There's a whole list of specific diseases that doctors and hospitals and laboratories have to report to the department. And so we can see trends, which is really, really great. And salmonella is one of the diseases that alerts us to the fact that there may be problems in the food chain. And in this case, we saw that some local college students were affected, but also local residents in the town. It was a small college with only one dining hall, but 17 local restaurants accepted the student dining cards. And there wasn't any widespread illness on campus, so the investigation focused on the restaurants. And what happens here is the epidemiologists, who are trained investigators, go out and talk to all the sick people and ask them questions. And in this case, many of them had eaten at a popular chain restaurant in a local shopping mall. So the inspectors, the epidemiologists, followed up at the restaurant. And no employees were reporting illness at that point. But they did see a large correlation between the number of unrelated ill individuals and the people who had all reported eating at this particular restaurant within the incubation period for the disease. So the regulators determined that it was the restaurant, this particular one, was an imminent health hazard. And what was required was voluntary disposal of all prepared and exposed food, cleaning and sanitizing of the food and non-food contact surfaces, and exclusion of the employees and replacement with employees from other establishments from the same chain. Now that was key. If the chain had not been able to bring in employees from elsewhere, they would have had to close down because we just didn't know how, it was obviously being transmitted, this disease, in the restaurant. Salmonella is a person-to-person transmission, or person-to-food to person. And so we didn't know at that point which employees it was. They all were reporting that they felt fine, but we had persuasive evidence that the illness was coming from this restaurant. And luckily for the chain, they were able to bring in people from elsewhere. So then, within the next few days, one employee admitted, yes, he had been diagnosed with salmonella a few weeks before, and he'd been treated by his own physician. Over the next several days, other employees began reporting symptoms of illness, and in the end, 8 out of 29 of these employees tested positive. And one included the primary baker who made all the bread products sold and used for sandwich preparation. So under our regulations, this is required that before returning to work, these food employees are ordered to get tested and submit 2 negative stool samples before being allowed to return to work. This particular investigation lasted 3 months. Finally, by March 5th, all the food handlers had passed with the 2 negative samples. But the important point here is without the work of the regulators, the disease transmission would have lasted indefinitely, much longer, and continued to spread in the community. And salmonella can be deadly for people with compromised immune systems. So in Massachusetts, we have a really good system of epidemiologists and lab people working together to catch these things. I mean, so it's interesting. It's like sleuthing work, really. Sometimes it's very mysterious. You know, why do we have this cluster of disease, and where is it coming from? But in the case of foodborne illness, if you really drill down and look at all the details, we usually can find where it's coming from. So that's all I have. But before I close, I just wanted to mention one other very different thing, actually. And this is the way that the department is also trying to help small farmers and local food. I don't know if any of you have heard of mobile poultry processing units. Okay, I see some nods here. In Massachusetts, we've had a pilot program for the past 3 years where some small farmers around the state have used these. These are people who grow a small number of chickens on their own farms, and they want to find a way to easily slaughter and process the chickens. And without having to go to a USDA-inspected facility, I think there may only be one of those in Mass for chickens, and that's difficult for them. Anyway, so this coming Monday at our Public Health Council meeting, we are going to give a presentation and announce that we are proposing regulations and protocols for the operation of these. So the project will move from a pilot stage into a permanent phase. The regulations themselves are one page, actually. I wrote them. But the key document is going to be the protocols, which will describe exactly how the units will have to be handled as far as keeping temperature control, enough ice, training for operators of the equipment, and things like that. And we are actually very grateful to the New England Small Farm Institute that wrote a guide. Probably we will end up, if not adopting the guide in whole, certainly taking pieces from it, because they did a really good job with this technology. So the MPPU, Mobile Poultry Production Unit, is for on-farm slaughter and processing, and there's going to be, as I said, a presentation to our Public Health Council on Monday at 250 Washington Street. So if any of you are interested to learn more about it, it's a public meeting, so feel free to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basso, and to Quentin and Asia and everyone for putting on this fantastic event, and thank you for your time listening to this. I don't want anyone to come out of this talk thinking that food safety is not important. The thesis that I want to submit to you is much more subtle than that, and often it's easy to get into an us versus them, sort of a regulators versus industry idea. And that idea is counterproductive both for food safety and for the economic security of the kinds of small producers, small farms, small food businesses that we have here in New England. My thesis is that the food ecology that we've created through subsidy and regulation is deeply unhealthy. This should come as no surprise to anyone in this room. Food safety regulation has had the effect of creating market consolidation in the large food companies. These regulations visit costs on small producers that are out of proportion to their market share and to the risks that they present to the public. And so in doing so, food safety regulations, when applied in the ways that I'm talking about and when designed in the ways that I'm going to get into, have the effect of reducing public access to locally produced foods, at precisely the moment when an increasing number of people are looking for these foods, an increasing number of people are turning to farming, turning to food production as a livelihood. The idea is that food safety regulation, like much regulation in the United States, imposes upon businesses compliance costs. And from an economic standpoint, these costs, many of these costs are fixed costs. That is, they're costs which do not increase with each additional good produced or sold. These are not costs of inputs to produce another gallon of milk. These are the costs to operate a dairy, regardless of how many gallons you're producing. Fixed costs serve as a barrier to entry. They keep small food businesses from effectively producing, marketing, and distributing products. And to the extent that regulations impose compliance costs equally among large and small businesses alike, the costs can serve to benefit large food businesses, which are able to spread the costs across a larger production of food. We have this idea in American business and in American economics, which is the economy of scale. It seems sort of second nature to us. I think all Americans are born hearing about the economy of scale. And this is the idea that the marginal cost to produce a product grows smaller with each additional product produced. And it seems like an inevitability. It's an axiom that the large have this advantage over the small. And this is just competition. It's just the way it is. But I want to challenge that idea that the economy of scale works the same way in all cases and for all businesses. Fixed costs frame the economy of scale in which a business operates. That is to say, the reality is that the marginal cost to produce a good grows smaller with each additional good produced only, and this is the important part, so long as the fixed costs remain constant across the entire production. The regulations which impose a constant burden on both small and large producers serve relatively to benefit large producers relative to small ones, by forcing small ones to operate within the same economy of scale as large ones. I'll give you 3 examples of what I mean. Regulations which impose record-keeping requirements often impose this sort of equal playing field burden that benefits large producers. Regulations that mandate processes rather than outcomes. And regulations which are designed explicitly or implicitly around the realities of larger farms and larger food businesses. For record-keeping requirements, I want to talk about the National Animal Identification System, which was part of the Food Safety Bill in 2009, but, and I hope someone will correct me if I'm wrong, was stripped out in the bill that passed. In 2009, the system was designed to be implemented such that each location where an animal may be found would have to be registered. Each animal would have to be registered and tagged, and records would have to be kept of each of the events that may transpire during the animal's life. And there's a list of events including when they're tagged, when they're moved to a premises, when they're moved from a premises, when they're euthanized, when they're slaughtered, and when they're mixed with animals from another premises. These records would have to have been submitted to the USDA within 48 hours of an event, because the goal is to have 48-hour track back. The regulations also provided for batch tagging, which is where you could tag a group of animals, a single population, on the basis that they were going to all be in the same place for their whole lives, that they were never going to be commingled, and that essentially the same events would happen. It's sort of a concession to the reality that you can sometimes treat a bunch of animals as a group. But the realities of animal farming, particularly on small farms and particularly in New England, are such that animals are not often birthed on the premises where they will spend their life. Even where they are, they're often commingled with animals from other premises. A lot of these small businesses are diverse businesses. They have maybe they're birthing their lambs, but they're getting chickens every year from a hatchery. And so batch tagging is not available to small, diversified animal producers. So this regulation gets it exactly backwards. It benefits the record-keeping costs on large producers are minimal. They can make one entry for the batch of tagged animals, where the requirements on small producers are excessive. And I can sense an argument that this is just record keeping, and how hard is it to sort of keep a list of what happens to your animals, and you should probably be doing this anyway. But I want to submit to you that if paperwork is something that you are good at doing, there are a lot of easier, better paying ways to make a living than as a farmer. I want to talk about the second way that food safety regulations benefit large businesses relative to small ones, and that's by mandating processes rather than outcomes. And here I want to talk about two things. I'll touch on pasteurization, although I'd not wanted to talk about that because I thought it would be controversial, and I feel like this audience may be more sympathetic. But I want to talk about the candling of eggs. In Connecticut, where I practice, I have a client who's a restaurant, and last year he wanted to shift to locally produced eggs, and he found a person who had under 100 chickens and was willing to sell him enough eggs to operate his restaurant. But the rules require, first of all, inspection, and second, require a candling room and a lot of processes and infrastructure and equipment that for 100 chickens you're simply not going to do. And these are rules for consumer protection. These are rules that are intended to keep people from getting eggs that are graded wrong. So this is to protect the person going to the grocery store and not really caring. It's not to protect a chef at a restaurant who knows what a fresh egg looks like and who is not going to be taken advantage of by this person with whom he has a relationship. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll skip quickly into the third one, which is when regulations are implicitly or explicitly designed around large producers. And an example for that is buffer zones around fields where crops are grown. It's fine if you have 1,200 acres to put a buffer zone between a stand of wood and a crop, but there are farms here in Massachusetts that are growing on 2 and 3 and 4 acres and are making a living at it. And to the extent that things like buffer zones impose costs and make it harder for these small producers, the regulations are counterproductive. They impose higher proportionate costs on the small amount of land that's available in New England. I want to address a potential rebuttal, which is sort of what I call the market share argument, and that's the idea that it's all very well to say nasty things about large beef producers, let's say, who are having to do these well-publicized national recalls. But the argument is that there's really very little evidence that small local producers are very much safer than large ones. And I want to address that by talking about 2 points. The first is something that Professor Basso brought up, the idea that when there are more links in the chain, between the producer and the consumer, there are more hands. And I submit to you that it's in fact more complicated than that there's both a horizontal chain and a vertical chain. And that when you're selling commodities, when you're consolidating, then at any point where you add a new consolidated input, you're multiplying at an exponential rate the number of parties that have had their hands on the goods. So it's not just that the spinach comes from 20 different places, but it's also that then at the next step the eggs come from 20 different places and so on. And the second argument that I have is that in the main, as a tendency, not as a rule, small producers tend to produce in a more natural manner than large ones. And what I mean by that is that they produce under conditions which more closely resemble the conditions in which the animal evolved and adapted. So for instance, I'll get back to cattle and then I'm going to have to go. There are significant studies that show that feedlot cattle, which are fed grain for much of their lives, generate and shed many more acid-resistant bacteria than cattle that are grazed. And the reason for this is that cattle evolved to eat grass. The rumen is much more neutral of an environment than the human stomach. And so bacteria that are adapted to the rumen will not be adapted to the acidic environment of our stomachs. But when we feed cattle grain instead of grass, the grain ferments, it lowers the pH of the rumen, and it creates an environment in which acid-tolerant bacteria are able to thrive. And these are the same bacteria that are able to make it through our own stomachs. And for these reasons, I think that small and local producers are an essential part of food safety. Thank you.
And our last guest is Bailey. Let me get the. You got it? Okay, great.
Try and stand over here, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, I'll move back. I just want to thank briefly my fellow panelists, Professor Basso, the Northeastern University Law Journal, Asia and Quentin for putting on a great panel. I'm also very happy. I'm originally from Beverly. My parents live in Danvers, so I'm back in the area. My sister's a Northeastern grad, and I actually see in the audience a 1L who I refereed in under-8 soccer in Beverly, which is pretty spectacular. So, I'm going to be presenting on what I call the food safety fallacy, and start that now. Here's a sort of roadmap. I'll talk about, put things in context, and talk about two sides of the debate over the issue, refer to old and new public health and define those. I think Priscilla talked a lot about what I would call and what Professor Epstein would call old public health. Talk about government regulations that didn't make eaters safer, and I guess the next one's self-explanatory, and then come up with some alternatives that I propose. So first of all, Food Safety Modernization Act, I don't have to say much. That's been referenced before. And its purpose is to reduce foodborne illness chiefly. So the debate really had two sides. On one side, there was one group saying, academics, advocates, and such, we need more. The FDA needs more power. It needs more money. It's been struggling. There's an Institute of Medicine report that came out last year that a professor of mine was actually one of the people who helped draft it, and they concluded that the FDA needed more power and more money, and the FDA in the person of Commissioner Hamburg said, why, yes, we need more power and more money. On the other side, there's a columnist in Forbes who said, hold on a second, that really won't help anyone. So obviously there are two starkly, can you see? I'm sorry, I don't mean to stand in front of you. There are two stark, there's a division in I'd like to explore it by looking at past efforts to improve food safety and to see how those have gone. So I guess first of all, the estimates of foodborne illness and death that were caused in the United States, I think were 75 million cases a year and 5,000 deaths, which is both are terrible. Those estimates, as soon as the bill passed into law, were reduced by 40%, still very high, but obviously the higher numbers were used to justify the $1.4 billion budget. And I just want to point out that this isn't just an FDA or a USDA issue. The FDA did attempt to ban recently electronic cigarettes, which by any measure are much, much safer than smoked tobacco. And you can look to the work of Michael Siegel if you want to learn more about that. Also, there was a 22-year ban on immigrants coming to the United States who were either HIV positive or had AIDS. 22 years. The science even 22 years ago wouldn't have supported that. Thankfully, President Obama did lift that ban, but obviously there are laws that rest on flawed science regardless of the field. So on to this old versus new public distinction, or public health distinction. I think that based on what I've heard here, others would support the idea that food safety really is something that deals with food and public health. This old public health, which I alluded to earlier, Professor Richard Epstein talks about how it's meant to prevent communicable diseases. bacteria in food that we buy, whether it's meat or packaged foods. And the Pure Food and Drug Act of 06, that's 1906, did in fact, allow the FDA, well, what became the FDA, to seize adulterated products in interstate commerce. So that was very much the mission of the FDA from its start. Then there's the new public health, which really doesn't deal with the transmission of disease, and it's really a catch-all, for really anything that could be considered a quote-unquote public health issue. And I argue, and others have as well, that it enables a certain sort of mission creep. Examples of this new public health, there's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. What exactly, what disease seatbelt use has to do, and what exactly is the CDC controlling or preventing when it mandates or suggests mandating seatbelts, for example? I'm not suggesting that seatbelts aren't important, but they're certainly not preventing a disease. There's also the FDA's Keep Food Safe blog, which I promise you, I'm the executive director of Keep Food Legal. It has nothing to do with Keep Food Legal. The FDA highlights the Four Loko ban on their food safety website, so clearly they see this. There was never any allegation. Are you all familiar with Four Loko? How many of you have consumed Four Loko? How many of you will admit to having consumed Four Loko? One, okay, thank you. So ultimately, food safety really encompasses the old and the new. This is, I guess, a roadmap for the examples that I'll be discussing, and I may as well, in the interest of time, just get into those. My point, though, at the bottom here is that many of these bans, if not all of these bans, are not only unproductive but counterproductive. They didn't make us safer, they actually made us less safe. So first of all, Thomas Jefferson, you've all heard of him, in his notes in the state of Virginia, which I think was written in 1781, talks about the notion that about the role of government, and it was a limited role, which one, I guess you can read from his quote, but he also talked about, and this is his famous quote about religion, but he also talks about actually food safety in there and how ridiculous the French government was because they banned the potato. I don't know if there are any Belgians in the audience, but I'm going to say, make the sort of French/French fry connection. And the idea that they would ban a potato seems pretty ludicrous. The allegation by the French government in banning it was that it caused that slew of leprosy, early death, rampant sexuality, not necessarily in that order. And it took a gentleman whose name I won't attempt to pronounce, but who had been imprisoned in Prussia and who had subsisted only on potatoes during his 2 or 3 years there to come back to France and say, you know what, actually this kept me alive. And at that point they still didn't listen to him. Finally in 1785 there was a famine and potatoes suddenly became okay to eat and saved lives. There also was, tomatoes were banned in various places because they were alleged to be poisonous. They are related to the nightshade, which is poisonous, but tomatoes certainly aren't. And coffee with milk was banned in Turkey and elsewhere because it was said to cause leprosy. Coffee fine, milk fine, coffee with milk, leprosy. The Meat Inspection Act of 06, which was signed the same day as the Pure Food and Drug Act, and which created this army of USDA inspectors, basically brought into being this poke and sniff method. I don't know how many of you are familiar with poke and sniff or not, but it's pretty descriptive of what USDA inspectors would do. They would poke the meat with either their finger or their hand or a metal rod. They would sniff it, and if it smelled good, then that meat was great. And if it didn't smell good, then obviously it wasn't good. Obviously, bacteria is a lot smaller than anything that you can see, and something can be covered in bacteria without you actually having the ability to smell it. I think we all are familiar with that. Sometimes you open your fridge, it smells. You know there's something bad, but there could be something bad in there even if you don't smell it. So this system was replaced by HACCP, which I won't get into because there's too much. But so anyway, the biggest problem wasn't just that you couldn't see the bacteria, but it was that USDA inspectors were transmitting bacteria from dirty piece of meat. Picture it. They touch this dirty piece of meat. They smell it. it smells fine. They put it back. They pick up the next one. Well, there's bacteria on their hands. They've just essentially become a vehicle for disease transmission. That meat then goes to the consumer, and bad things happen. I guess I will at least elaborate here on HACCP that the biggest problem with HACCP, while it does help sort of establish means for preventing detection or preventing detection of bacteria, it doesn't actually help with detecting it. And then, interestingly, I just came across this article the other day. For 30 years, this is from 2007, the USDA was not exactly on the job. I can bring that back later if you want to read more. I'll go through this one quickly, but the saccharine was the first sugar-free, non-caloric sweetener. It came out in the 70s. There were a couple Canadian studies that showed that large amounts of it, when fed to rats, caused bladder cancer in those rats. Certainly very much in excess of what a human would eat or drink over a large period of time. The FDA tried to ban it. Groups that were in favor of, were promoting dieting or were looking into the interests of diabetics said, we could actually use some of these non-calorie sweeteners. FDA said, no, we don't think you could. Congress said, no, actually they could. So the FDA did put a warning, which I don't know how many of you are old enough to actually remember that, but there was a warning on, say, cans of Tab, which I also don't know how old, if you all remember that. Anyway, a series of sort of deregulations occurred where just, I think 2 weeks ago, the EPA finally, in 2010, removed saccharine from its list of cancerous and hazardous constituents. They were supposed to do some study. It took like 35 years. But during that time, the FDA and EPA made people less safe. They scared people away from potentially non-caloric sweeteners. And if you believe that sugary soda contributes to obesity, then the FDA and the EPA were actually promoting obesity by limiting choice. And certainly diabetes is another problem there. And then I mentioned Four Loko earlier. The FDA recently, in December, after a year of study, banned beers that contain caffeine. And I wrote an article at the time, actually before the ban came out, where I noted that people have been drinking rum and Coke, Kahlua, other things that contain alcohol and caffeine, or perhaps drinking a cup of coffee while drinking a cup of wine. Now, the primary science, which was authored by Mary Claire O'Brien, a medical doctor at Wake Forest, she talked about mixed drinks, so rum and Coke, vodka and Red Bull, things like that, rather than premixed like Four Loko, which comes in a can, which is 12% alcohol and has about as much caffeine as a cup of coffee. So the science was not applicable to the actual product that was banned by the FDA. And finally, there are a bunch of caffeinated drinks without added caffeine. They're still in the market because you can still have coffee, oatmeal stout beer that has very high alcohol, possibly, and a bunch of other, guarana is still fine, mate, which is a South American, Argentinian drink. Those can all be added to beer. Moonshot, which is created by a woman from Boston who actually helped found Sam Adams, was 5% alcohol, and I say was because it's been banned by the FDA. It was 5% alcohol and about as much caffeine as half a cup of Starbucks coffee. I'm not certain how that possibly could have gotten anyone, quote-unquote, blackout drunk. So the demise of Four Loko probably made no one safer. People are still drinking. College kids are still drinking. If the problem was underage drinking, then there are mechanisms in place to combat that, and they should be utilized. So in summary here, I think I've repeated it over and over. These regulations didn't make people safer. They actually made people less safe, and for these very reasons here. So in the interest of proposing alternatives, I'll start here. Most people say, most advocates, I guess, for more regulation say that we need more regulation. And when they get more regulation, they say we need more regulation and more money. And by we, they mean the government. And budgets nearly always increase, whether it's the USDA or the FDA or whatnot. But as I note here, advocates always seek more money and more power. This is Marion Nestle, who's one of the most prominent food safety advocates in this country, or possibly anywhere. This is, I think, from Wednesday of this week. So she wrote something where she talked about if she had a magic wand, and she could wave it, what would she do to fix food safety? The food safety bill, I mean, the ink isn't even dry, and she's already looking forward to the next regulatory intervention. And she proposed 8 different changes here, and 7 of them involve more government power and more taxpayer dollars. So, and I did allege back here that budgets nearly always increase, and I just want to demonstrate that that is in fact true. On the left-hand side, you see that USDA budgets generally, and that's in 2000 real dollars. On the left-hand side, it's I think 1965. On the right-hand side, it's 2007, I want to say. And as you can see, you could draw a straight line pretty much up through there to show that they have increased. On the right-hand side, if you say, oh, but wait, food safety spending hasn't increased. Well, no, in fact it has, by a lot. So it's now, I think that was 2007, it's well over $1 billion for the USDA. One last point, the egg recall that you're all probably familiar with, there were a number of eggs recalled. I think it was roughly 1 for every American. And advocates at the time claimed that the USDA didn't have enough power, they didn't have enough authority to, they were just there to grade the eggs, and the FDA, meanwhile, didn't have the power to inspect. Well, if you look at the American Egg Board, which is funded by the USDA, founded by the USDA, and the USDA actually appoints the members of the Egg Board, the duty of a USDA egg grader, according to the American Egg Board, includes things such as considering that food safety. So I allege here that the egg graders offer this veneer of safety. You see USDA, AA, extra large on there, and you think, oh, the USDA checked it out. That's cool. Well, apparently it's not cool. And in doing so, the FDA and USDA made food less safe here. So this is, I guess, the beginning of my conclusory remarks. I'm going to propose an alternative here, which is to return to the old public health. What Priscilla talked about, basically, that if meat falls on the floor or contains bacteria, the government can step in and say, no, that's bad. Preventing the spread of mad cow disease, that's another proper role of government. I mean, no one wants mad cow disease. And there are agencies that have been created specifically to prevent that. When I refer here to agencies exercising new powers in the old way, the FDA didn't have recall powers up until the Food Safety Modernization Act. There's toxic waste, nuclear sludge candy, which was recalled voluntarily. I was from somewhere in Southeast Asia, I think, and the joke, they have the nuclear explosion on the right and the toxic sludge on the left. Well, it actually contained lead, and it was candy for kids. So should the government be able to get that off the market? Yes, absolutely. One point at the bottom here, which is going to carry over to the next slide, is that scientific consensus isn't always the answer. Scientific consensus is always wrong. The flat earth theory, obviously, is the best example of that. And also that America is not, although I feel like we're creeping toward it, we're not a technocracy, and the Constitution didn't contain those provisions. What were the founding provisions? The harm principle, the idea that government should act only to prevent harm to others, rather than the precautionary principle, which our keynote speaker this morning referred to, which is big in Europe and is becoming more prevalent here, that you need to prove things are good in order for them to be allowed in the market. Even North Korea, Myanmar, name your authoritarian country, they don't have 100% food safety, and obviously they have little or no freedom. I would prefer more freedom, and who will be our watchdogs? Obviously, there's a whole list of people who aren't going away if the FDA regulates less. In fact, they'll be relied upon more. Consumer Reports, the Center for Science and the Public Interest, their Nutrition Action and Health Letter, their litigators speaking next door right now. They have some great suggestions. I don't agree with everything they say, but some people do, and that's the marketplace of ideas. Marion Nessel, Michael Pollan, and the legal community, if some food producer injures me, I reserve the right to sue them, and I think that everyone should. So this is my last slide. This is a quote from Jefferson that directly follows the quote that I showed you earlier. Give you a moment to read it. And so really, Jefferson was talking about the USDA and the FDA, and the anti-Jeffersonian food safety regime we have right now is this regulatory scheme that is governed by bad passions and private and public reasons. And I hope that we can change that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists and I'd like to invite them to come up to the front for a Q&A session. We have roughly 20 minutes, so I'd like to use my prerogative as moderator to pose a couple of questions. And I guess Balin's sort of presentation sort of sparks the obvious sort of question. And I might kid him a little bit, saying that maybe he's shooting fish in the barrel here in some respects. Some of the story. And I guess the real question that I would pose here is, it's one thing, and I think we all agree that smart regulation, if we're going to have regulation, all is what we want. The question is, I guess, the dilemma that the modern consumer faces, and this is the real dilemma, I think. I think we can all agree that the old-style public health, as we call it, preventing foodborne disease, preventing transmission of diseases, is something that we all agree on. And yet, a lot of the food issues we deal with may have little to do at times, or a lot of the things that's driving food policy questions may have less to do with making sure that the spinach is not contaminated than having consumers concerned about knowing what's in their food, period. That a lot of, especially prepared foods, which dominate our food system these days, or food that has had nutraceuticals added, or food that has had all kinds of things things have done to it. That's, I think, a lot of what's driving the concern. I think, in many respects, I think what drives the concern is less, the sort of stuff we understand, and sort of need for make sure that again, our spinach doesn't have salmonella in it, or that that our eggs and those kind of things are safe. I think people could agree on that, although obviously there are going to be debates there in terms of small versus large producers. That's a classic question. But I think one of the dilemmas here about food safety is, what do we mean by safety? Is this the narrow construct of disease, or is it a larger construct of health? That's, I think, a bigger dilemma here. And so I'd like each of you to sort of comment on that, because obviously from different perspectives, whether it's the farmer's perspective, the local state public health perspective, or the broader construct of regulation versus, if you want to set this up artificially, versus markets. I think there's a newer concern that's sort of infiltrated over the last 25, 30 years, and I think what drives a lot of people is that it's not so much just about health in the narrow sense, it's health in a broader sense. How do we know what we're eating actually is healthy for us? So I ask each of you to sort of comment, and then sort of, if you want to respond to each other, feel free.
Well, I guess I can start, and let me be clear, I'm speaking personally at this point, not as representing DPH, because I don't know what they would say to that question. That's a very good question. But one thing that concerns me personally is kind of the dual food system that we have in the U.S., where people in poor communities don't have access to the kinds of food that middle and upper class people do. They simply don't, or they can't afford that kind of food. So they end up with a lot of fast food, with less nutritional benefit, a lot more fat. And there are actually studies being done on it. There's a term for it. It's called food deserts. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but in the inner city, people may have to travel miles and miles to get to a regular grocery store that we would take for granted. Organic food is another great example of that. I happen to shop at a food co-op, and I buy mostly organic food, and I can afford it. Most people can't afford it. And so that's a choice. I shouldn't say most people. People in the lower socioeconomic strata cannot afford that. So we can talk a lot about markets and choice, but in effect, they don't have a choice to buy organic food. And they also don't, again, the food desert concept, they don't have a choice to go to farmers markets because those farmers markets aren't located in places where poor people live, and they don't have access to transportation, or transportation is expensive. So you get where I'm going. And that really concerns me. And I don't like the idea that we're turning into a country where we have two food systems, but I'm afraid we are.
I think it's a good question, and I think this is actually an area that shows sort of the limits of scientific consensus, because the consumers hear so many different things from so many different sources about whether eggs are good because they have a lot of protein, or they're bad because they have cholesterol. And honestly, to me, the real issue is something that I brought up a moment ago, which is how closely does this resemble the kinds of foods that have historically been eaten. And we've deeply distorted the kinds of natural scarcities that would arise by subsidizing things like corn. We've made beef plentiful, and I wrestle with arguing against the corn subsidy, because I realize that one of the things that I'm arguing against is the 99-cent burger, and it seems deeply anti-egalitarian to say that there shouldn't be, the guy with 99 cents in his pocket shouldn't be able to get a burger if he wants to. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of other costs to the system that we have, and that ultimately our ancestors ate far less meat than we did, and that's where I look, and that's where I would say that consumers should look.
Yeah, I think I guess one area that I think is ripe for dramatic change, which Adam just alluded to, is the subsidy system that really skews and distorts what we eat, what we serve in schools, and the very ingredients in our food. I mean, that McDonald's hamburger, as Michael Pollan has pointed out, has like 19, well, I may be exaggerating, but it has a heck of a lot of corn-based product. I mean, the beef cattle that's in the burger was fed corn. There are corn additives and bun, and they're probably in the ketchup and the mustard. The onion somehow has corn in it. And I mean, I think that the government has made a conscious effort to subsidize, and our elected officials have done so, and that really influences what we eat, and we end up eating less healthy because that's the case. If when people talk about sustainable food or the real cost of things, eliminating all food subsidies immediately, I think would really be the best way to render an immediate and dramatic shift in what we eat and the quality of what we eat.
Let me just follow up, and then toss it out to the audience for questions. This question of risk. From your view, is the discussion on risk that we can have in the United States in particular, and the way we frame our thinking about food, which is a heavily cultural set of discourses, obviously, is our conception of risk skewed in such a way that we often, as a society, make bad choices? Or what is your thought about risk? I mean, obviously, from a Priscilla's view, the questions about risk are much more proximate. That is, keeping rodent stuff stationed out of candy. But even there's a sort of the dealing with, for example, the accidents that happen. To the broader question of how do we think about risk in all these equations about the role of government, the role of markets, the role of the producers, et cetera? Take a look at that one.
I'll
Sure.
step. I'm just picturing. I think we should all bear the risk that we're willing to bear, and that's, I think, a different level, and possibly a different level per issue for every person. I'm sure that people in this audience take different risks than I do, and I take different risks than you do. skydiving, driving without seatbelts. These are all decisions that we either we do or we don't make. And I think that for example, raw milk. I am in favor of the idea that if people want to drink raw milk, that they should be able to. And that doesn't mean that I drink raw milk or that that I'm coming down on the side of raw milk over pasteurized milk. But if there are people who are willing to take what I think probably is a somewhat increased risk in getting some sort of foodborne illness, then I think that they're willing to bear that risk, and then they should.
Thoughts? All right, let's open up for questions then. Speak up, please.
Hi, my name is Ariella, and I'm planning on being a food safety. My problem with what a lot of the time you're not choosing to eat contaminants. And just to go back to the beginning of what you were talking about in your presentation, when you're looking at 1906 the Food Safety Act, it's not like that just led to a decline in food safety. That was a reaction to the jungle where they had all of these reports of meat being dragged along the ground which had been had human waste on it, which had been spat on, and there was actually a tremendous American food history, American food regulation, that finally the government was going to step in and make sure that there were some safe boundaries. And it's true that it wasn't based on the best science, because science has evolved a tremendous amount in the last 104 years. But realistically, I mean, regulations are there for, I feel like regulations are there for a reason. That if I want to give my child spinach, I think that that is the safe choice. It's not like choosing to have unsafe sex or choosing to drive without a seatbelt, where I know what the two options are. It's spinach. And I know that one of the people that was sickened or the whole thing was a child whose mother had ground spinach up and sometimes. But it's not the same as choosing to have it. It's not the same. Our government to make sure regulations are in place. I choose when I think I'm choosing a healthy option, not McDonald's fries, but spinach. I'm not going to kill my 9-year-old. And so I guess my first is sort of take umbrage with the thought that there's still the hope and sniff. Science has come a long way, starting with wearing gloves and washing hands when you're inspecting food. Also, what would you have for what, because realistically, I was getting, messages that were very anti-regulation, and I feel the information out of science, they're there for a reason, and while some things do downstairs tonight or this afternoon, and no one's
So the question, of course, is to what degree do consumers have the knowledge or the ability to make choices? If it's a choice configuration you're talking about, big risks that we understand. What about the risks which we don't understand or that we don't know about?
First off, although conditions in Chicago when Sinclair wrote his book were terrible, the book is a novel, a fictional account. So I just wanted to start with that. I guess you asked a bunch of different questions in there, but I think I was pretty clear that I support regulations that deal with the old public health, and the presence of some sort of bacteria on spinach certainly would fall under that. Obviously, regulations haven't ensured that that doesn't exist. Moving on to another point, which is that you said that science has improved. Well, HACCP only came into being, which was the improvement upon poke and sniff, in 1998. There was 90 years, roughly, of unscientific poke and sniff, and the notion that people wash their hands or wear gloves, it doesn't matter at all if your hand is perfectly clean. If you touch a dirty piece of meat and then a clean piece of meat, regardless of how clean your hand is, you're still transmitting bacteria from one point to the next. So I do support regulations that, as I said during my presentation, do engender the original intent of the USDA and of the FDA to actually keep foodborne contaminants out of food. My presentation was about really was noting that a lot of the science on which some actions are based don't work, and also that the new public health is not something that the government should be involved in. Is that clear?
I think that my other question would be, how do you feel about the regulation of human this is a saccharine debate, FDA getting into food. What kind of science do you want there?
It is harmful and it's getting into food.
I want to talk a little bit about the presupposition that may be in the room that food is something that can be without risk, because it's not, and it will never be entirely without risk. Simply by its very nature, it is a source of nutrients, not only for us, but for the bacteria which far outnumber us, even in this room. And I think that we make a lot of decisions on the assumption that things are perfectly safe. I don't actually work out how likely I am to get hurt in a car accident when I get behind the wheel. I have an assumption, but that assumption may or may not be borne out by the facts. And I don't really have an answer for you, except to say that there will always be risk. Honestly, I think that the groundswell of public interest is the most promising thing right now. I think that there's a great deal of path dependency in regulation and in sort of the larger food industry, but that it's the interest from the consumers, I think, that's driving this, and that to me is the most exciting thing that I see.
And just as an example, the mobile poultry unit that I talked about earlier, I mean, the people who were interested in that came to us. They also came to the Department of Agricultural Resources and the Department of Environmental Protection because there are wastewater issues. And we work together. And sometimes I know it can be frustrating for local food producers when they look at the myriad of state regulations that do apply or the different agencies that are involved. And it took a while. I mean, we had the pilot project going for 3 years, but ultimately I have to say it was a success. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with all the stakeholders, and, most of them were very pleased at what we've been able to accomplish working together. So I think that's right. I think, the groundswell will come from people out there who want to do things in a different way or kind of go back to the old way of doing things, and then you'll have to train us, the regulators, what you need. And we listen. I mean, that's why we hold public hearings and things like that.
Can I just say one? I live in Washington, D.C., and it's sort of recently become, if not a mecca, then a fantastic place to eat from mobile food trucks. Some places they're over-regulated to death. D.C. actually loosened their regulations in 2007, and that allowed food trucks to really flourish. And echoing Adam's point, the city then, restaurants said, "Oh, hold on, you need to regulate these food trucks more." And actually, these Twitter followers and others in the district came forward, and the city opened it up to comments, and I think there were 98% positive in support of food trucks. So really the consumer has a lot of sway with regulators and with elected officials. And be a problem, or if you want change, then get on the phone.
I'm interested. Asking them a similar question that I'm going to pose to you guys. I've gotten a lot of different results. And the question is, when there is a presence and a push to make farms more accessible, it seems like it is still difficult for farms to operate in the same conditions that large farms are operating, what you were saying. And I can't get a clear read on whether that's just a lack of push at regulation more accessible with for small farms, or is that an active push by larger companies like Monty or Monsanto to close that gap? And so small farms need to move forward. Is have been able to make that move, or is it that they've been prevented by larger industries?
In my experience, it's neither and both. The circumstance that I want to use to respond to this is that there's a grocery store chain in New Hampshire and Massachusetts that will allow its authorized vendors to drive a pickup truck up to the loading dock and unload cabbages or what have you. But those vendors have to have liability insurance, and they have to have and be following a HACCP plan. And these are things that are put in place by risk managers for the grocery store chain and by their insurance company. And the insurance company wants indemnification, and in a lot of cases, the HACCP plan again, or the GAP plan. There's a lot of record keeping. There are a lot of these sort of same costs that then come into play when you're distributing at that level.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was just going to say, DPH really, we don't get involved with vegetable farms at all. The only reason we're in the poultry example that I used is that we're mandated to regulate slaughter and processing. So I don't have a lot of knowledge. Well, I don't have really any knowledge of what the regulations are here on vegetable farms.
I guess the question is labeling. Is it, for the most part, in your mind, is it beneficial to have all the details, including perhaps the existence problem?
I guess I just worked for 9 months a year or so as a labeling attorney. Answer that. A food labeling attorney. I think that honest labeling is going to label, regardless of whether it's mandatory or voluntary, then it should be honest. And I think the consumer should claim that there's X in your product and it isn't there, then that's a problem that I think courts can deal with. In terms of like GMO labeling, I think that as I understand it, you can't, and you probably know this better actually, about the what is it, the RMDH, I guess.
Recombinant bovine growth hormone.
Bovine growth hormone.
Which I guess was banned in Vermont, and then they attempted to permit acres, producers, and dairies, I guess, in that state to, say no RMDH. And I think if you want to label honestly, whether it says, we don't contain GMOs or GMOs stink, if that's your opinion, or whatever, that's fine. I mean, that's your product space if you want to words on it. And I think that's fine. As far as mandatory labeling, in spite of having just worked in the field, or perhaps because of it, I'm not an enormous fan. I also wouldn't buy a product that just had a white label. I wrote on this, I guess, but if it just said peanut butter, then I'd want to know more, and I think most people would too. I think the market has a fantastic way of forcing labeling by sort of having consumers demand that, and consumers buying products that provide more information rather than less.
I think we have time for one more question, I think. One quick one. Okay, we have time for one quick question before we move on. In the back. The use of antibiotics, especially in food. That's practically the whole question about antibiotics in particular. Yeah. Anybody want to tackle that one? The dilemma it poses to us in the modern food system, and perhaps the overuse of antibiotics, especially in meat. The issue of localism versus big food systems.
Because I prefer to buy organic personally. Some people, as I guess by the end of the day, will have heard, I prefer to buy antibiotic-free and organic, but some people can't afford that. So I preface my remarks with that. I don't like the idea that antibiotics are in food. They're not necessary in most cases. Perhaps they are for feeding millions of people as opposed to individuals. As far as I know, based on the science, they've not been shown to be harmful to people. I know that they're used, as far as I can understand, to get, say, a chicken that would take 45 days grow to a certain size to grow to that in 42 days or something like that. And perhaps to have some sort of residual health impact on the chicken to make it less sick. I don't really buy that argument personally. Like I said, prefer to buy organic. But as far as like a policy prescription around that, I don't. Unless those antibiotics are leaching in the water or something like that, that's a different issue. But just on a purely antibiotic in food basis, I don't really have a policy prescription.
I want to push back a little bit on what you just said, because I know that there are dairy farmers who, when a cow gets sick, they simply can't afford not to be selling all of the milk that they produce, and they do sell milk with antibiotics in it, and they're not allowed to, but they do. I know that this happens. Not, I hasten to add, by any of my clients, but I do know that this happens.
That you know.
And I think that a lot of the issue of antibiotics can be addressed by the economic stresses that are on producers and by the environmental stresses that are on the animals. And for these reasons, among a myriad of others, I think, again, that sort of direct sales and the ability to do value-added products will do a lot to alleviate the economic pressures that require farmers to sell antibiotic-laced milk?
Again, I'm speaking personally, not from DPH. We don't have anything to do with this because we're preempted on the federal level in terms of antibiotics. But I am almost certain that there are a number of studies showing increasing antibiotic resistance, so that antibiotics that can be useful to treat human diseases there are fewer and fewer of them because the diseases are becoming resistant to the antibiotics because of overuse in animals and overuse of them in food. I also believe that there is some evidence that it's getting into water supplies. So I think it's a bad, personally, again, I think it's a bad policy to use antibiotics growing animals, unless they're sick. And yes, I mean, I think if the animals are legitimately sick and need to be treated, fine. But then I think probably that animal, there's a certain maybe number of days that it needs to be kept out of food production so the antibiotics can clear its body. That's speaking personally, again.
Well, obviously, we've just touched very lightly on a whole sense of contested issues, complex issues, within an incredibly interwoven, complex sort of marketplace and foods and production system that at the end of the day does produce something we all rely on, and that's our food, which is why it's so important. But to thank our panelists again, and just to remind us that no matter what argument we have about the role of government or any other issue about public policy, food is a great area to study because everything comes out. So thanks again, and I think we're getting ready to break for lunch.